Did you know that on July 2nd, 1964, the United States crossed one of the most important thresholds in its history? With one signature, President Lyndon B Johnson enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a law that confronted nearly a century of discrimination, segregation, and injustice. It changed the legal landscape of America, and the moral landscape as well. This is the story of how the nation arrived at that moment. Here is your host, Pastor David. Pastor David.
Thank you for joining us today on Voices of Life, a ministry of the Church for Life. I'm Pastor David. The Civil Rights Act did not appear suddenly. It rose from a long struggle that followed the Civil War. After 1865, 3 constitutional amendments reshaped the nation. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection, and the 15th Amendment protected voting rights. Yet despite these promises, Southern states built a system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow, a system that lasted for generations. And I think we talked about Jim Crow in the last podcast, and Jim Crow had nothing to do with the Civil War. It had nothing to do with segregation. It was just a term from an actor back 30 years before the Civil War that used to use blackface comedy. However, that is what it's been referred to. So, under Jim Crow, schools were segregated, restaurants, hotels, theaters, buses were segregated, voting rights were blocked through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and employment opportunities were restricted. And in 1896, the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson declared separate but equal, giving legal cover to segregation for decades and constitutionalizing it. So, in the real reason here, or the real segregation, came from Plessy v. Ferguson. It was not Jim Crow. So, just to be clear, that was the real decision maker. And moving with that thought, by mid-20th century, the struggle for equality reached a breaking point. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. But many states resisted, forcing federal intervention, igniting a movement that would reshape the country. Key events of the civil rights movement included 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, 1957 Little Rock 9, 1960 Greenboro sit-ins, 1961 Freedom Rides, 1963 Birmingham Campaign, 1963 again March on Washington, and 1964 Freedom Summer. There were all kinds of images of police dogs, fire hoses, bombing of churches, murdering of civil rights that just shocked the conscience of a nation. So violence, and especially in the South, that is really what pushed this through. We also talked about in our last podcast how the NAACP, rather than doing a frontal attack or defense on all this, they just chipped away at Plessy v. Ferguson one case at a time, and that's how they got to the point they are. So on June 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation. He declared civil rights a moral issue, not just a political one. Kennedy proposed sweeping legislation to protect public accommodations, voting rights, school desegregation, employment opportunities. 4 very important parts there. Unfortunately, on November 22nd, 1963, he was assassinated before the bill could pass. After Kennedy's death, President Lyndon B Johnson stepped forward with resolve. He told Congress, "Let's continue." So Johnson used national sympathy, his experience as Senate Majority Leader, and he was able to put together some bipartisan support. Now remember, Johnson was a Democrat, and most of these segregation laws all came from Democrats. And Democrats controlled Congress for decades. So it was a lot to get a big mind change going. But he was able to push the bill through Congress. Many historians believe his leadership was decisive. The Civil Rights Act faced one of the longest filibusters in Senate history. It began on March 30th, 1964, and lasted 60 working days. It was led primarily by Southern Democrats. Here we go back to the Democrats again. Got to remember, Lincoln was the first Republican in office as president, and he was the one that did the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves and all those things and worked toward that. But there were things that went along with that. But the Democrats continued to hang on to the old ways. So opponents included Richard Russell, Strom Thurmond, and Robert Byrd. Some of those names we probably know because they were in Congress up until not too long ago. On June 10th, the Senate invoked cloture. And in cloture, the first successful cloture vote on a civil rights bill. The vote was 71 to 29, final passage 73 to 27, and it was signed July 2nd, 1964. So what did the act really do? Well, the Civil Rights Act contains 11 titles. Here are the most influential ones. Title I, protecting voting rights. Title II, ban discrimination in public accommodations. Title III, allowed federal lawsuits to desegregate facilities. Title IV, strengthened school desegregation. Title V, expanded the Civil Rights Commission. Title VI, prohibited discrimination in federally funded programs. Title VII, banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And VIII, created Equal Opportunity Commission, EOC. Now, one thing to note about all these titles and all the interpretations that gave some of these things from the Supreme Court decisions all went back to Marbury v. Madison. And a few podcasts ago, we talked about Marbury v. Madison, that it was self-serving, there was bias, there was conflicts of interest, and if that ever gets overturned, a lot of these titles would be gone overnight. A lot of the Supreme Court's authority would be gone because none of those positions that decision gave the Supreme Court, none of those powers are in the Constitution. They're actually unconstitutional. And at some point, I could probably see in our futures, if we had a constitutional event convention in the future, I could see where the Supreme Court has a lot to lose as far as powers, and a lot of these things would go away and have to be redone a different way. Depends on how the Constitutional Convention went. So just to be clear, so a lot of these things are dependent on Marbury v. Madison. Segregated businesses began to disappear. Schools integrated more rapidly. Federal funds could be withheld from discriminatory institutions. Employment discrimination cases increased. The federal government became more active in protecting civil rights. But voting discrimination persisted, leading to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided stronger protections. The Civil Rights Act became the foundation for later protections involving women, religious minorities, people with disabilities, older Americans, LGBTQ plus individuals, and so on. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in Bostock v. Clayton County that Title VII protects employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, nothing in the Constitution says anything about this stuff. This is an interpretation of the Supreme Court that depends solely on Marbury v. Madison. So opponents argue the federal government was overreaching, businesses should control their own policies, and states should regulate their own affairs. Now again, with some of these titles where they go into the hotels and the gas stations, they use the Interstate Commerce Act. Well, I don't know how many hotels necessarily are in two states at the same time. There may be chains, things like that, but each one is independently owned by a franchisee or a corporation or something like that. And to say the federal government has jurisdiction because of the Interstate Commerce Act, that's a big stretch. So again, that's one of those things that I think will come back later on and eventually be straightened out. Supporters, on the other hand, responded that said constitutional rights had been denied for over 100 years. States had repeatedly failed to protect equal treatment. Federal intervention was necessary to enforce the 14th Amendment. But remember, in our Bill of Rights, anything that was not specifically given to the federal government, to Congress, is retained by the state. It's very clear. And none of this stuff is in the Constitution. None of this was delegated or given to the federal government. So one could very well argue that the actual act is unconstitutional, or most of it. So again, I think we're going to see some changes there in the future. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 stands alongside the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Brown v. Board of Education, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. That's another one, fair housing. How does the federal government get jurisdiction there? Those go back into state rights. But together, these measures dismantled the legal framework of segregation in America. So the ends was a good thing, but the way we got there was not necessarily the way I would have liked to get there. I would have liked to get there on solid constitutional grounds. On June 11th, 1963, Kennedy proposes legislation. We said November 22nd, 63, Kennedy was assassinated. February 10th, 64, the House passes the bill. March 26th of 64, the Senate begins that long debate. June 10th, 1964, cloture was invoked. June 19th, 1964, the Senate passes the bill. And finally, on July 2nd, 1964, Johnson signs it into law. From a pastoral point of view, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did more than change laws. It changed lives. It reminded America that equality is not automatic. It must be defended, protected, and lived out. This is Pastor David. You're listening to the Voices of Life, a ministry of the Church for Life. Thank you for joining us today. Grace and peace be with you. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us today on the Voices of Life podcast, a ministry of the Church for Life. As we close, may the stories we share strengthen your faith, steady your heart, and remind you that God is present in every chapter of your journey. If this episode encouraged you, share it with someone who needs hope. And until we meet again, walk in truth, stand in courage, and keep listening for the voice that leads you forward. This has been Voices of Life. Peace be with you.